Dear friends, welcome back to this phenomenological lecture series by Professor Stephen Crow from Rice University. Last week, we actually have two lectures, which is focused on I would say the issue of origin of normativity. And Professor Crow not only introduced his own theory, but also connected to the Heideggerian's theoretical thoughts. In this lecture today, we will see he tried to move on and develop the whole theory in computation against the Stephen Darwall theory, and at the same time borrowing some inspiration from Levinas in the primary ethical phenomenological theory, at the same time the Heideggerian thoughts. So now let's welcome Professor Stephen Crow.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and I'm very happy to be back to continue these discussions about normativity and reason. Today, I want to take up a problem that we have been treating from last time, which I've been calling a normativity first account of reason. That is to say, I'm looking for the origin of reason and reason giving in response to the demand to take over being a ground, as I talked about it in terms of Heidegger last time. That is to say, in terms, reason is grounded in my view of what is best to do. So what I'm doing today is looking at Darwall's account of the second person standpoint, which I think is a paradigmatic example of a reasons first account of moral normativity. And it focuses on the validity, intersubjective validity of reasons. And I want to contrast this in a certain way with Levinas's account, in which validity and rational justification is made possible by our response to a normative claim. So in this way, I'm saying that Levinas and Heidegger are on the same page, so to speak, even though there are many differences between their views. But on this issue, I think they are very close. In an earlier version of this paper, I discussed Levinas in connection with Heidegger's notion of conscience, and we can talk about that, if you will, at the end. But my main point is that phenomenology is a way of approaching philosophical questions, and it's quite independent of the particular, ideology of individual phenomenologists. In other words, we are directed ourselves, each of us, to read a person like Levinas or Heidegger or Merleau-Ponty with a critical eye to see which parts of their account really have phenomenological evidence. And so it's not, phenomenology is not a system, but a way of doing philosophy. And so we have to think for ourselves. So this also brings up, what I'm going to do today brings up issues that arose in the first talk, namely, how can we recover a notion of autonomy on genuine phenomenological grounds? So I think the autonomy theory of, say, Kant and Fichte and their followers gets much right. But to really become convincing, they need to be placed on a phenomenological footing. And that's what I'm trying to do in these various lectures. I guess that's enough by way of introduction, and we can talk more about that toward the end. But let me just start here with the paper on second person reasons, Darwall, Levinas, and the phenomenology of reason. It's about 4 sections. And I start with what are second person reasons? And of course, I'm drawing on Stephen Darwall's book of that title, and all the quotations, though I haven't indicated where they come from, ought to be fairly clear in terms of context. Where quotations occur, they belong to Darwall or Levinas or whoever is being discussed. Okay. So what are second person reasons? According to Stephen Darwall, second person reasons are valid normative claims that we make on one another's conduct and will. Though such claims can be embedded in attitudes like resentment or codified in particular laws or prescriptions, their pragmatic force is that of a command. But not every command, it seems, makes a normative claim in Darwall's sense. When you tell me to open the window, this command purports to give me a reason and can be formulated as a prescription. You ought to open the window. But such a command works on my conduct and will only by means of side considerations. I ought to open the window because I too feel that the room is too warm, or because you desire to be cooler and I desire to satisfy your desire. In short, my reasons for acting are what Darwall calls state of the world regarding and agent neutral. I have reasons to obey because it will make the world a better place, no matter who addresses the command. And so this really amounts to a request. Please open the window. Such commands then are not claims on me. That is, they are not normative. A command that addresses a normative claim, one that can be expressed as an obligation, addresses itself directly to another's will, and if the claim is successful, it provides the other with a second personal reason for acting. A reason that is agent relative, that is, it simply wouldn't exist were it not for a specific sort of relation to one another in which you and I stand. If you step on my toe and I say, get off my toe, I have addressed a claim to you that is meant to determine your will directly, apart from any of your desires or evaluative beliefs. It can be formulated as, you normatively must get off my toe. And this normative must is a putative second personal reason. Darwall's question is this: what conditions must be in place with respect to our relations to one another in order for second person reasons to exist? As a first approximation, he writes, what makes a what makes a reason second personal is that it is grounded in de jure authority relations that an addresser takes to hold between him and his addressee. Second person reasons thus depend on the presupposition that you have the authority to order me to get off your toe. What can give you that authority? Darwall's analysis of the second person standpoint is meant to answer this question. Quite generally, addressing a claim to another can give the other a valid second person reason only if the addresser and addressee share a common second personal authority, competence, and responsibility simply as free and rational agents. The normative authority to issue binding commands then, and to hold someone accountable for carrying them out, must be shared. A command issued by someone who possesses an authority that the other does not possess, such as a sergeant's order to a private, has no validity unless it rests upon deeper normative ground where authority is shared. However hierarchical, Any address of a second person reason also implicitly presupposes a common second person authority as free and rational. Asymmetrical authority relations derive their power to constitute second person reasons only because they rest upon symmetrical authority relations in which we stand toward one another as free and rational agents. The demand for symmetrical authority arises from Darwall's focus on the validity of second person reasons. If second person reasons exist, that is, if they are valid, then a whole set of conditions must obtain, without which a command lacks the power to constitute a valid agent relative reason for me to act here and now. But even if this is true, it does not rule out that a command addressed to me could have other kinds of power, other ways of binding me that do not depend on what I want or need. Darwall considers such a situation in the case of coercion, that is, a command that rests upon some non-normative power. But are all asymmetrical commands instances of coercion? And if not, might such a command be itself a condition for being able to entertain second person reasons? These questions lie at the heart of Levinas's phenomenology of the face, which I will take up later in this talk. Before we can address them, however, we must explore Darwall's picture in a bit more detail. How should we think about the normative felicity conditions, he borrows that phrase from J.L. Austin, that must be presupposed if second person reasons are to be valid? Such conditions make up what Darwall calls the second person standpoint. So the second section, second person standpoint, performative and objective attitudes. Here I want to focus on two phenomenological features of the second person standpoint, its holism and its character as a performative attitude of persons. Let us begin with the latter. Because second person reasons are agent relative in the sense of being practical prescriptions that guide the will directly, they can appear only to one who occupies what Jürgen Habermas called the performative attitude of a person taking part in interaction. This is contrasted with the objectivating attitude of a non-participant observer, a third person attitude, which annuls the communicative roles of I and thou, the first and second persons, thereby causing this realm of phenomena, second person reasons, to vanish. So this is a drawing on speech act theory. Darwall appeals to the moral phenomenology of what P.F. Strawson calls reactive attitudes to illuminate this point. My indignation at being trod upon differs from anger at you being the cause of my pain, because indignation includes the consciousness of the violation of an underlying normative expectation that is valid not only for the two of us, but ultimately for all competent actors. If one tries to account for the normative character of indignation without appealing to this second person aspect, say by appealing to the social desirability of such norms, one violates what Darwall calls Strawson's point. Desirability is a reason of the wrong kind to warrant the attitudes and actions in which holding someone responsible consists, someone responsible consists in their own terms. That is, it's a violation of the first person understanding and meaning of that kind of responsibility. The relevant moral intuitions are available only if one remains in the second person standpoint, the perspective one assumes in addressing practical thought or speech to, or acknowledging address from another, and in so doing, making or acknowledging a claim or demand on will. That this is a performative attitude is indicated by two things. First, the second person stance is a version of the first person standpoint. That is, a version of the I's performative character, which Darwall explicates in terms of Fichte's notion of self-positing. Second, What the second person stance excludes is the third person perspective, in which one regards oneself agent neutrally or objectively, rather than as the addresser or addressee of a normative claim. This point illuminates the matter of the second person standpoint's holism. The performance in question can best be thought of as belonging to a kind of game whose rules are already in place and to engage in which one must be second person competent. What makes a second person standpoint game-like is the fact that it consists of an interdefinable circle of roles: addresser, addressee, skills, competence, standing, authority, and so on, a circle which one cannot break into from the outside. Thus, each of these concepts implies all the rest and can be justified only within the circle. So an account of second person reasons cannot provide a ground for the game, but can only identify the rules or presuppositions of the game. The idea that second person reasons entail symmetrical relations of authority thus arises within the circle of concepts that define the second person standpoint. For Darwall, these concepts include second person authority, valid claim or demand, second personal reason, and responsibility to. And together they define the kind of entity who can play the game. The player must possess second person competence, namely freedom, the ability to be moved by second personal reasons, and dignity, the authority to make normative demands on and require accountability of others. In other words, players must be free and rational agents, that is, persons. Indeed, the very concept of person is itself a second personal concept. We will return to this circle in a moment, but first we would do well to consider Darwall's argument for the necessary symmetry of the authority possessed by players in such a game. Second personal reasons exist only from the second person standpoint, that is, only from the standpoint in which I am either the addresser or the addressee of a normative claim where someone else is involved. The validity of such a claim, according to Darwall, depends on the addresser and the addressee sharing a certain second personal competence, namely that those we address can guide themselves by a reciprocal recognition of the second personal reasons we address and our authority to address them. In this sense, autonomy is a presupposition of the second person standpoint. Indeed, second person competence is a law to itself, since it is the basis of second person authority. How so? We'll explore this point a little more about autonomy. The answer lies in what Darwall calls Fichte's point. We can be held morally responsible only for what we can hold ourselves responsible for by making moral demands of ourselves from the perspective of one free and rational agent among others. If that is so, then there is symmetrical authority between addresser and addressee of a normative claim, because these roles are interchangeable. One person cannot demand of another person anything that they could not demand of themselves. I am accountable to another. I am not accountable to another for anything that I cannot demand of myself. Now, if the very concept of person is itself a second personal concept, that is, if players in the game are defined by the interlocking circle of concepts that comprise the game, the essential features of personhood are also defined, free and rational. I cannot have a second person reason to do something if my will is responsive only to causes or motives that have no normative force. That is, I must be free. Nor can I have such reasons, as opposed for there being reasons for me to do something, unless I can be moved by reasons as reasons. That is, I must be rational. Thus, whether I issue a claim or am the recipient of one, the capacities that matter are shared between addresser and addressee. The claim succeeds in providing a second person reason only because the roles of addresser and addressee are supported by a more general status or standing that we both share, the authority to address second person claims. Darwall reinforces Fichte's point by considering Samuel Pufendorf's version of theological voluntarism. Though on the voluntarist picture, moral obligations are all ultimately owed to God, Pufendorf's point is that an obligation can arise only if God addresses us as rational agents. God can hold us responsible only if God can assume that we can hold ourselves responsible in our own reasoning and thought. Otherwise, the command could move us only by fear of sanctions that might coerce compliance. Now, Darwall acknowledges that the voluntarist picture takes a moral hierarchy for granted and then derives the rest of morality by fiat from that. Strangely, however, he interprets Pufendorf's point to entail that holding ourselves responsible in our own reasoning and thought requires that we must be able to take up a second person standpoint on ourselves and hold ourselves accountable from that point of view. But why should this be? If being able to take up simply means that it is possible for me to do so, this does not entail that God's command can reach me only if I do take up such a standpoint. As Darwall acknowledges, for Pufendorf, each agent forms a moral community with God alone, with God being accountable to no one. Thus, it may be true that one can form such a community with God only if one can hold oneself accountable to oneself before God. And it may also be true that one will have this capacity only if one is also capable of entering into a community of mutually accountable persons. But it does not seem to follow that entering into a moral community with God alone requires that one actually take a second person standpoint on oneself. It could be that the moral community with God makes taking up the second person standpoint on oneself possible. The alternative would be to say that for God to be able to obligate us by a command, we must stand in a second person relation of symmetrical authority with God. Such a view does away with moral hierarchy, to be sure, but it also does away with God, which seems to be Darwall's point. So let's move on to the third section, the validity of second person reasons. This last point provides the transition from an analysis of the presuppositions of valid second person reasons to a phenomenology of obligation, which, as I shall argue, addresses a gap in Darwall's account. Throughout the text, Darwall's analysis operates on two levels. The first level reflects on the presuppositions of the game, based on the performative attitude of the players. The second level acknowledges the limited scope of the game itself. It is something that we assume or adopt or enter into. The first level entails that the circle of concepts cannot be broken into from outside. That is, no rational ground for it can be offered. The second level, however, admits that this sui generis game is neither exhaustive of our lives, and hence of our phenomenology, nor automatic. Somehow, out of a wider field of experience, it requires uptake. There is nothing necessary about the game, or rather, if there is a certain necessity to it, some other explanation must be given, something outside the game itself. Otherwise, we might well be duped by morality. That is, the game might be no more than a game, no more than rationally optional, or worse, illusory. There would be second person reasons within the game, but none of them would have validity. Despite its restricted character, Darwall notes that as a matter of psychological fact, there is no obvious way simply to refuse to see things second personally. We are indeed socialized into the game, but this is of only limited philosophical significance, since the question is whether we should see things in this way. Darwall's conclusion that we should follows from an argument that appeals to the essential self-reflexivity of practical reason. We have no more reason to doubt the validity of second personal reasons than we do any other kind of practical reasons. We need not explore this argument here. The point is that morality is a practice into which we must, in some sense, be inaugurated. And such an entry move can be approached from two angles. On the one hand, we can approach it in terms of developmental psychology and the history of moral enlightenment. Darwall and Habermas both follow this path. On the other hand, we can approach it phenomenologically through an analysis of those experiences that are something like phenomenological presuppositions for entering into the moral universe of the second person standpoint. In taking the second approach, I will argue that Levinas's phenomenology of the face helps us to understand what those experiences or those presuppositions might be. While Darwall's Kantian transcendental approach to the second person standpoint does describe necessary conditions for valid second person reasons, his phenomenology of obligation fails to do justice to the asymmetrical relation in which I and the other encounter one another. Levinas's moral phenomenology highlights a kind of obligation that I acknowledge before I am a person. And it requires that terms like freedom, desire, and rationality be given a different analysis, one that suggests why the second person standpoint is something other than a psychological necessity. So let's turn to Darwall's phenomenology. Darwall regularly appeals to phenomenological evidence. For instance, when he acknowledges that the second person standpoint is a performative attitude in which I experience claims as claims and do not merely consider them. Phenomenologically, the presuppositions of such an attitude are the intentional implications which make such experience what it is for the engaged agent. An agent, the person, who is constituted by engaging in second person practices. This means that the person is intelligible to itself as the one whose life is normatively at issue in what it is doing. Another phenomenological point becomes salient when Darwall rejects recognitional meta-ethical theories, which reduce second person reasons to our desire for some outcome, a desire that makes us feel as though there is some reason to realize the outcome. Surely, Darwall objects, object-dependent desires and Morean intuitions do not exhaust the range of our ethical experience and intuitive judgments. And if such appeals to experience can be accepted, we should also accept the evidence of reactive attitudes, which acknowledge second-person reasons grounded in the second-person standpoint. They produce powerful feelings of recognition and respect based solely on the free and rational nature of the other in question. The primary phenomenological evidence in Darwall's account of second-personal reasons, then, lies in his appeal to reactive attitudes. Such attitudes, for instance, indignation that someone has stepped on my toe, or the resentment that arises if no apology is forthcoming, are constituted by the experience of the violation of a normative claim that I expect the other to acknowledge merely because I have the authority to make such a claim, an authority which the other must acknowledge because it is grounded in our shared status as free and rational agents. Persons are agents who can be moved by second-person reasons, therefore they ought to be. Now, because Darwall focuses on reactive attitudes, his phenomenology of moral normativity highlights those claims that I can legitimately make against the other. That is, the experience is one in which I am the addressor of a claim to the other, be it only in my feeling and not otherwise expressed. Thus, the question seems to be how my claim can be valid. And Darwall answers that validity is possible only if I and the other can exchange places. But the phenomenological question I want to explore does not concern validity directly. It is this: must reactive attitudes move in this self to other direction? Levinas's moral phenomenology is, in fact, grounded in a reactive attitude that moves in an other to self direction, thereby uncovering the origin of the second person standpoint itself, and so of the person, an entity who can respond to second person reasons thanks to the asymmetrical relation between the addresser of a command and the addressee. So I will now turn to Levinas's phenomenology of obligation. The most distinctive feature of Levinas's moral phenomenology is his insistence on the original asymmetry between the addresser and the addressee of a command. This asymmetry means that while his phenomenology is second personal, that is, I appear first of all as the you accusative of a command, it is not an instance of the second person standpoint, and so does not entail that the command gives me a second person reason to act. How then does Levinas describe and defend this asymmetry? The addresser of the command, whom Levinas calls the other, is originally experienced as other only when I experience myself as commanded. The other occupies a normative height because the command is experienced as an interdict, a restriction, an interdict, thou shalt not, on my freedom, a line that I cannot cross. Nevertheless, the normativity involved here is not mediated by a presupposition of symmetry. As he says, the other and I do not form a number. Indeed, I, you, these are not individuals of a common concept. Thus, I cannot initially claim an equal status to command the other based on a shared set of characteristics, being free and rational, being conspecifics, or anything else. Rather, the other can demand more of me than I can demand of the other. And so I cannot exchange places with the commander. In my singularity, I do not have any resources for making normative claims. I learn what the normative is through the other's command. As Levinas expresses it, the other's command teaches me something that I could not in principle, be myotically educed from myself in Socratic fashion. Clearly then, the command does not give me a second person reason, but nor is it entirely unconnected to reason. For Levinas, to experience the command is to experience an interdiction on a freedom that I already possess. Such freedom is the living being's power, its ability to remain the same in its environment by, for instance, assimilating that environment to itself as nourishment. His metaphor of eating covers a wide swath of our free life. Clearly, such freedom is not defined in terms of rational self-determination and includes nothing normative in its exercise. The interdiction on such freedom, epitomized for Levinas in the command, thou shalt not kill, is the birth of the normative in the living being, the feeling of obligation. This might appear to be a version of theological voluntarism, but Levinas's phenomenology does not conform to Pufendorf's point, namely that for God's command to constitute an obligation, it must be addressed to me as a free and rational being. Instead, Levinas argues that it is in my response to the command that I become a being whose freedom is rational, sensitive to reasons as reasons. But given the asymmetry between addresser and addressee, Mustn't my response to the command be the result of asymmetrical power relations, that is, coercion, the fear of sanctions? Levinas frequently describes the other as the stranger, widow, and orphan, which suggests that addressor to addressee power relations are far from his thoughts. At the same time, he can characterize my relation to the other as hostage, obsession, and so on. How are we to untangle this matter? Levinas describes the interdictory command as the end of powers. The freedom that belongs to the living being is evidenced in the I can, the experience of my power to appropriate the otherness of my environment through the normatively heedless satisfaction of what I want and need. But experience the interdict transforms this factual power or freedom into normative powerlessness. The interdict is not a violent imposition on my freedom. It is the experience of the impotence of violence. What I learn is the moral impossibility of killing. If I hear the command, experience the other as a height, then while I can still kill the other, I cannot thereby eliminate the obligation not to kill. This is just what normative binding amounts to. Even if I violate the command, I'm still bound by it. The experience of this kind of powerlessness is what initiates me into normative space, a subset of which is precisely the space of reasons. At this point, however, it might still appear that I can only be coerced into acknowledging the binding character of the command. If my response doesn't already include recognition respect for the addressor, what motive could I have to acknowledge the other's authority to command me? Here, Levinas's second-person phenomenology diverges radically from Darwall's account of the second-person standpoint. For unlike Pufendorf's God, the other has neither the authority to command nor sanctions to impose. The command rests on nothing but itself. It is the first word, and hearing it makes language, according to Levinas, and so also reason, and so also questions of authority, validity, and justification possible. How then is hearing the command to be described phenomenologically? Desire as a reactive attitude. Levinas's approach returns us to the question we raised above. Is there a reactive attitude that does not involve my being the addressor of a claim against the other, but is my reaction to a claim I receive from the other? Levinas calls such a reactive attitude desire. But for him, desire is not oriented toward the satisfaction of a need, a lack that I experience in myself. Rather, it arouses in me an awareness of goodness. Thus, what Levinas calls metaphysical desire is not a pro-attitude toward things that might satisfy the various hungers that beset me as a living being. And it cannot be satisfied by any achievement in the course of life. The desire for goodness is aroused by the interdiction on life's freedom, experienced not as violence, but as an investiture of freedom that liberates freedom from the arbitrary by orienting it toward what is better than being. By calling freedom into question, investiture promotes my freedom by arousing my goodness. That is, freedom experiences its moral vocation. In contrast to Darwall, then, Levinas's phenomenology of desire is not a recognitional theory of moral normativity. Desire is a reactive attitude in response to a command whose authority does not entail symmetrical relations between me and the other. And this asymmetry means that in being addressed by the other, I have not been given a valid second personal reason to do something. Instead, the normative power or ethical resistance that awakens my desire for goodness moves me to welcome the other. Welcoming stands opposed to appropriating the other in terms of what I want and need. And so it is principle dependent in something like Darwall's sense. But if the principle, or arche, is possible only as a command, it originates beyond myself, and so I cannot be this principle. Because the first word is obligation, I can welcome the other only by speaking to her. Hearing the command obliges me to enter into discourse, and indeed the kind of discourse rationalism prays for, a force that convinces even the people who do not wish to listen, and thus founds the true universality of reason. The phenomenological connection between welcoming the other, or hearing the command, and language lies in the way that the interdict, which calls my freedom into question, transforms the rapacity and solipsism of freedom into generosity. In language, I freely give to the other what was heretofore my possession alone. Language is a primordial dispossession, and the generality of the word institutes a common world. The concept, or reason, is the shape the world takes for a being who has heard the command and so has entered into normative space. As opposed to the faceless apeiron from which the living being satisfies its needs, the world in which I welcome the other is something given, that is, both perceptually and intellectually shared. To speak is to make the world common, to create commonplaces. Thus, for Levinas, the second person standpoint depends on the prior welcoming of the other by a freedom not initially inclined toward rationality. And the language that arises between us does not only serve reason, but is reason. So if there are second person reasons, reasons that depend on symmetrical authority relations, they should appear in the context of Levinas's account of reason and reason giving as a response to the investiture of my freedom by the other's interdictory command. Before getting to that, however, we must address a key question raised by Levinas's phenomenology of obligation, namely, who is the other? So, conscience, section 7. Here I will present a rather free construction of what I take to be a phenomenologically defensible answer. And the first step is to confront the theological language in which Levinas often presents his descriptions of the other. We have already alluded to this in our phenomenological take on Pufendorf's point. God's command can reach me without any presupposition that God and I share a second personal authority to command. It may be that it can reach me only if I'm able to adopt the second person standpoint, but actually adopting such a standpoint is not necessary in order to hear the command. This maps onto Levinas's idea that the other approaches me from a height. And so it is tempting to hold that it is God who commands me through the other. But Levinas claims that his account does not limit a mind in a way inadmissible to a philosopher. That is, it is not based on any theological dogma. Rather, it arises from the phenomenological analysis of horizons inaugurated by Husserl. What counts is the idea of the overflowing of objectifying thought by a forgotten experience from which it lives. Further, Levinas insists that it is our relations with men that give to theological concepts the sole signification they admit of. Thus, the nature of the other's command, and so of the other as such, is conceptually distinct from any theology. However, the presence of the other, which Levinas terms the face, brings its own mysteries. For one thing, the face does not appear. It is neither seen nor touched. But neither is it a numinous entity. Indeed, as Levinas often says, it is beyond being, which means that it is altogether normative. It belongs to the order of the ought, not the is. The solution to these mysteries, as I see it, lies in Levinas's claim that the other cannot present himself as other outside my conscience. My original feeling of obligation is inseparable from what Levinas calls shame. The welcoming of the other is ipso facto the consciousness of my own injustice, the shame that freedom feels for itself. Thus, if philosophy consists in knowing critically, that is, in seeking a foundation for its freedom, it begins with conscience. As Sartre already described in Being and Nothingness, shame is not a feeling that a solipsistic subject could experience. Shame presupposes the look of the other, which objectifies me in a way that I could not achieve by myself. I thus experience myself as having an outside that is for the other before it is for me, one that I must claim as mine. For Levinas, conscience is this pre-reflective claiming as mine. But the face of the other does not simply deliver an objective view on myself that I cannot attain by myself, as Sartre thought. Rather, it is a judgment on my freedom. The interdictory character of the command can give rise to the reactive attitude of desire for goodness only if hearing the command is phenomenologically conscience, freedom's experience of its own violent essence. Shame, then, is the condition for welcoming the other. While it is psychologically possible to react to shame in many ways, its phenomenological essence involves desire in Levinas's sense, the possibility of measuring my freedom against what is better than being. Conscience thereby introduces me to what Levinas calls the dimension of the ideal, how things ought to be. This very point is occluded in Sartre's account of shame. While Sartre emphasizes that shame is a response to my being objectified by the look of the other, he does not explain why such objectification should yield precisely shame, that is, the consciousness of doing something that I ought not to be doing. Levinas's phenomenology addresses this lacuna. Shame is not a reaction to being looked at, but a reaction to being judged. In it, as Darwall also notes, I must connect my behavior to some ideal of a presentable or morally decent self. And it is this ideal of a morally decent self that is at issue in the desire aroused by the other's judgment. If this is true, then the phenomenology of conscience shows that there is a second personal form of address that is morally normative, but does not presuppose the sort of competence that Darwall's second person standpoint requires. The capacity to respond to such an address is not a presupposition within the game, but a possibility condition of the game, an entry move through which the moral community is constituted. To understand what such constitution involves, we need to look more carefully at how exactly the call of conscience, in which alone the face is present and the command can be heard, how the call of conscience is related to our capacity to enter into the space of reasons, and so also the second person standpoint. A final section, rejoining liberalism, second person reasons and commanding to command. If Darwall is right that second person reasons presuppose the symmetrical authority of free and rational agent, Fichte's point, then Levinas must show how such an authority can be ascribed to me if we start from a position of original asymmetry with the other. The key point is that conscience, as freedom's orientation toward the good beyond being, is what enables the living being not only to have reasons to do something, ascribed to it from the outside, as it were, but to respond to the normative force of reasons as reasons. Only such a being can enter into the game in which second personal reasons are possible. The argument for this rests on Levinas's claim that desire, welcoming the other in conscience, is discursive, initially taking the form of apologia. Here I am to account for myself before the other. Apologia is thus the essence of conversation and is the origin of justification and reason giving. Levinas notes that his account of the origin of obligation rejoins liberalism at the point at which the latter promotes the person insofar as he represents nothing further, that is, in its singular individuality. If one starts from the social whole, in which the person is initially experienced as a role, a type or role, Levinas's liberalism means that individuals retain their secrecy. The reasons they address to one another cannot all be agent neutral, but must, at least in moral matters, retain a performative agent relativity that reflects the encounter of the singular with an equally singular other. This agent relativity is a trace within the reciprocal sphere of justice, of conscience, and the desire it arouses. It is the latter, the welcoming of the other across his judgment, which underwrites the universality of reason. Thus, secrecy is a necessary condition for having second-person reasons to behave in certain ways toward others. However, Levinas's liberalism challenges the idea that reciprocity is phenomenologically original or sui generis. The second-person standpoint rests upon a condition that can only be understood from the outside, lest the normativity at issue in it remain a mere game. In the original relation between me and the other who judges me, our relations are never reversible. How then does Levinas explain the moral reciprocity that belongs to second-person reasons? Despite the secrecy in which the original relation to the other occurs, the fact that this relation is a response to a call and not merely a step I take with regard to a thing means that what takes place here between us, namely putting the world in common through the generality of concepts, concerns everyone in the full light of the public order. My response neither cloisters me in the I thou, nor seeks the clandestinity of love. Rather, in the face of the other, the third party looks at me. The fact that my apologia in the face of the other, justification in the sense of giving account of myself, can become practical reason in the second person sense, rests on a kind of equality between us that does not eliminate the asymmetry, but rather consists in referring to the third party thus present at the encounter, whom the other already serves. The asymmetry of the command is thereby communalized because the other comes to join me to himself for service. Such a communalization of secrecies is a second command. If the first and original command is an interdict on my freedom, conscience, then this joining with the other for service is something more positive that arises when the thou is posited in front of a we, that is, the presence of the third party who looks at me in the face of the other. It is this presence, the whole of humanity which looks at us, that delivers the second command, where the beginnings of something like symmetry are discernible. This command can concern me only inasmuch as I am master myself. That is, only insofar as I myself have the ability to command. Here, I take it, the point is not that I have the right to address commands to others, but that the others' command, the interdict on my freedom, extends to the community made possible by language as putting the world in common. As Levinas expresses it, this command commands me to command with what he calls the prophetic word. Here, Levinas is thinking of the Hebrew prophets who took a stand in public before the people to call them back to their moral vocation. Thus, commanding me to command does not mean that I am commanded to command others, make claims upon them. Rather, it is to command myself, become master of myself, to be responsible in the sense of owning the way of going on that my desire for goodness prescribes. Only because I have first responded to the interdict in conscience can I be responsible in the sense of self-control, rational self-legislation, and autonomy. The desire for goodness aroused in conscience thereby targets a common good, not because it's derived from agent-neutral considerations, but because it has a kind of agent-relative universality which acknowledges the authority of all others to command. It thereby becomes second-personal. In short, to hear the command of the other in this twofold sense is to posit oneself as responsible. Such a responsible self is both more and less than the being that presents itself in the face. Less because the face summons me to my obligations and judges me, something that I cannot do alone. And more because it is within myself that I find the resources with which I can respond to the essential destitution of the other, to the one who lacks everything except the height from which to command. The second person standpoint then begins with apologia or confession. As Sartre puts it, my shame is a confession, and entails, thanks to the presence of the third party, what Levinas calls economic justice. In conscience, the reactive attitude that opens onto desire for goodness, I posit myself, that is, I understand myself as, or commit to being, responsible for a world in which a kind of symmetry holds between all of us. Levinas writes, the will is free to assume this responsibility in whatever sense it likes. It is not free to ignore the meaningful world into which the face of the other has introduced it. In welcoming the face, the will opens to reason. Here, the will is not, as it is in Kant, identified with reason, thus yielding the essential interchangeability of wills that defines the person within the second person standpoint. There is no pure practical reason. In rejecting the Kantian picture, Levinas rejects the idea that politics, the reciprocity of dialogue, can be a calculus, governed in advance by a reason to which we would all be subordinated. Instead, welcoming the other opens up a space of reasons that is never purely objective. Within this space, I am free to assume the responsibility in any way I like. That is, I remain capable of moral failure. But whatever I do in the meaningful world into which the face of the other has introduced me, I do in light of something like reasons, in light of how, in my desire for goodness, I take it best to go on, my reason. And I will be obligated to the other, all others, to give an account of myself, my apologia, which offers to others the world that opens up through conscience, my choice of an ideal that concerns all of us. In the end, then, Darwall's claim that such reason-giving presupposes the second person standpoint of free and rational persons seems correct. At the same time, Levinas's phenomenology of reason suggests that such a standpoint and the moral normativity it entails cannot be a self-enclosed game. Rather, it rests upon a phenomenological condition prior to personhood, namely the shame that singular freedom feels for itself in the face of the other's interdict, without which we cannot be persons at all. On the other hand, such a phenomenological ground is not eo ipso a refutation of moral skepticism, an ultimate grounding of the validity of the moral claims at issue in the second person standpoint. But Levinas's phenomenological defense of the idea that we are not duped by morality does not target the validity of second person reasons. Rather, it concerns the origin of reasons in conscience, the asymmetrical experience of a normative claim without which one cannot even raise the question of validity. For an ethical first philosophy, then, the skeptic's challenge to the validity of second person reasons always comes too late. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful talk. Maybe let's just very quickly open the discussion session. I think maybe you have some questions or maybe comments. Okay,
Hello.
Hello, Professor.
Hello.
Thank Thank you for a very interesting lecture. I have three questions. The first is concerning about Darwall's defense of the second person perspective standpoint. According to this paper, the second person standpoint have some speciality over the third person and the first person standpoint. It is prior to third person perspective because third person perspective may lead to some may presuppose some neutral observer from the outside, and the first person standpoint. According to your lecture, I heard that the second person standpoint might be another version of first person standpoint, and it will better to discuss the communication between I and the others. But I think that will the first person standpoint include the communication between I and the others, because when we talk about the phenomenon of the others are always appearing to me, and I could also discuss the communication between us from the first person perspective. So I'm still confused about the priority of the second person standpoint over those two. This is the first one.
Yeah, that's a very important point, and it's one of the claims I make is that a phenomenological approach to this whole issue is made possible because the second person standpoint is also a version of the first person standpoint from a phenomenological point of view. That is, and here's where in my view, though not in Darwall's official conception, the second person standpoint is one in which I experience myself as the addressee of a normative claim, by which I mean that I'm experiencing myself as being the you accusative, right? It's as though someone is saying to me, you must take over being aground, right? Or you must do something. And it's in that you accusative case that that's what I'm calling the second person. I experience myself as in the second person, namely as an addressee of an address by another, a you. I experience myself as you, which already puts me in an intersubjective context, right? There's already another being there who is addressing me. This stands in contrast to what I'm calling specifically the first person nominative, in which I say, in which I am the as it were, agent, where I am making a claim on someone else. But both of them are, in a phenomenological sense, first personal experiences. It is I who am experiencing myself as the addressee. And that's what I mean by the second person. And I think that's what Darwall means in effect too, at least in terms of these attitudes that he described, that I am the addressee, the one who is addressed by another. The other makes valid claims on me, moral claims. And I, in turn, can be the addresser of those claims back to the other, because our authority within the second person standpoint is symmetrical. And it's that's the point at which Levinas claims that Levinas's notion of asymmetry comes into play, because to be the addressee of a claim, I am situated as a you, as situated second personally. And that gives me no right, as it were, to change places with the addressor and make claims back, equal symmetrical claims on the addressor. That is to substitute a kind of rationalism for the phenomenology of being an addressee. When I'm addressed by such a claim, there's nothing in my being that allows me to say, oh, I can occupy the position of that other who addresses me, and I have equal authority to make claims on the other. Somehow, if there is, in political life and in justice, there is an equality that arises between us, it can't come by saying that the positions of addresser and addressee can simply be exchanged. There's an argument that I draw from speech act theory and from Jean-Francois Lyotard that shows why you can't really do that, but that's the basic point I wanted to make, is that merely because I occupy a first person point of view and the other occupies a first person point of view does not mean that we have symmetrical authority when we're in a situation of being one of us being the addressor and the other being the addressee. Did that answer your question at all, or follow up?
Okay, this follow-up might be my second question. That's about the symmetry and the asymmetry structure of the normativity. According to your lecture, there might be a lot of theoretical sources. I'm not familiar with these sources, but I want to ask, according to the symmetry model of the between I and the other, if I could, if the position of I and other could be interchangeable, then what's the difference between the position of I and other, and how could the other gain their otherness or authority? And for the asymmetry model of this, of that, how maybe according to Levinas, that others approach me from a normative height as an interdict on my freedom that makes me a normative powerlessness. Will this lead to the tendency of the theology at the end?
Yes. Yeah, I tried to suggest why at least Levinas himself says that this metaphor of height can't be read theologically. It's not an appeal to some position that would go outside of moral phenomenology and appeal to some sort of theological authority. The other Levinas, for Levinas, the other with a capital O, is not God. or at least from the phenomenological point of view, he's trying to make an argument on other grounds, basically on phenomenological grounds. So what are those grounds? The metaphor of height, I mean, it all starts with Levinas's conception of freedom, which is quite different from the Kantian tradition, or at least in many ways. Because for Kant, you're only acting free if you act in accord with the moral law. But for Levinas, freedom characterizes life. That is, if you think of animals, they are free in the sense that they go about their business maintaining themselves, right? They maintain themselves in accord with their actions by, for instance, as he puts it in kind of Hegelian language, transforming the other into the same. And his metaphor for this, or his example of this is eating. The animal confronts something other than itself, namely, let's say it's a rabbit or something, and it confronts some lettuce. This is other than itself, but it asserts its freedom by eliminating the otherness of the lettuce by eating it and transforming it into itself in the form of nourishment. So it takes the other into itself, and this is this is Levinas's conception of original freedom as self-maintenance, and you can see from this that that freedom in this sense has no normative character, right? And in general, I mean, the lettuce has no claim on the rabbit or the carrot, you know, it has no claim on the rabbit that the rabbit should not eat it. And the rabbit doesn't respond to any claim by the carrot. It just heedlessly pays no attention to the carrot except in terms of the rabbit's own needs and wants. And so freedom is the living being's ability to satisfy its needs and wants without any normative considerations, no obligations, no nothing. And so how do we move from that conception of freedom to a moral conception of freedom? And this is what Levinas calls the investiture of freedom. So you start with this, and then what phenomenon can call that whole non-normative, violent freedom of life into question? And this is what he calls the normative height of the other. When I recognize a command, for instance, paradigmatically, the command, "Thou shalt not kill." When I recognize the face of the other, which is nothing but this command or interdict, then I have effectively called my freedom into question. And the way that Levinas puts this is that if you take the command, "Thou shalt not kill," this has a normative force that retains its command character, retains its power over my power, even if I do kill the other or whatever. When I have confronted this command and understood its normative character, I realize that even if I do kill the other, I'm still obligated not to kill. And that's what I'm calling the the experience of the impotence of violence. So this is paradigmatic for Levinas's concept of normative force or moral check on freedom or obligation. So then the question is, I mean, most of us don't run around, hearing commands like "thou shalt not kill" and stuff. I mean, we learn them in school or from religion, but I mean, what is it phenomenologically to recognize that there is this whole dimension of normative interdiction, normative commands that my power is powerless to do away with. And that's what I think both Levinas and Heidegger identify with the call of conscience. And that's why I bring Sartre in there too, but because he has the same phenomenology, he just doesn't go far enough with it. He doesn't explain why shame should arise in being seen by the other and given an outside by the other. And the reason is that conscience is a judgment on myself. And so to see the face of the other for Levinas, or to hear the command, is essentially what Heidegger calls the call of conscience. Which there's a lot of background, to this whole phenomenological account, and one can maybe at any stage along the way say, "Hey, well, that's not right. That doesn't seem right." But my suggestion is that if we continue the conversation long enough and the argument long enough, we're going to be getting back to some point phenomenologically where my experience has to let in or allow a normative check on my beliefs and desires and all of that kind of thing, which I can't derive from myself. And so that's not to say that God puts it there. It means that I have now just entered into or understood what normative force actually is. Anyway, that's how I'm trying to use Levinas to explain it. And he uses an incredible sort of menagerie of terminology that, of course, is difficult to follow and maybe kind of off-putting for those who are more accustomed to the kind of arguments that Darwall presents, and I totally understand that. But I'm still trying to defend the point that Darwall's theory or Kantian theories or Rawlsian type theories don't account for the origin of normativity. They presuppose it, and that's why I said that the second person standpoint is game-like. And even Darwall said, he's the one who raised the issue about why isn't this just a game? I mean, why isn't morality just a game? And he struggles to answer that question. And I think it's a good one. If you just think of this whole constellation of interdependent concepts as what morality is, then you have to show why we should pay any attention to it, and or where, how it gets a grip on us. And he doesn't really, he has some clever answers to that, but I don't think they do justice to the phenomenology.
Okay, thank you. The third one is about the normativity itself. And in your paper, there is a lot of cases that are non-normative. And I think when talking about the relation between I and the other, it is more than the relation of commands. That's just a kind of expression of the between the other and I, or just I think might be kind of welcoming the other, and there might be other expressions of encountering others, like invitation, like would you like to go have a coffee with me? Is there any kind of normativity here, or the problem of normativity must be limited in the realm of moral, the realm of morality? I think the manner of others appearing to us already has some kind of normativity in a wider sense. Just like Malabundi will call this normativity as style or the dimensionality. So could we legally discuss normativity beyond the realm of morality?
I totally agree. I think normativity pervades all of our experience in various ways. That's what I've been trying to argue in some of these other papers. I focus on Darwall because and this Levinasian response, because he distinguishes between value theory and deontology, right? I mean, obligations and norms in the sense of values or goods, and so yes, in my own view, there's a wide range of normative phenomena, namely anything that can be judged in terms of better or worse, success or failure. These are all normative notions for me. And so Merleau-Ponty's wide variety of normativity is no objection, right? I mean, it's what I would embrace, because I think all meaning is normatively structured, and there are many, many kinds of meaning, including truth is a normative notion, and all kinds of values and so on. The point is that I'm interested in the origin of reason, and in reversing the tradition's reasons first approach to normativity, where they say, well, something is normative if we have good reason to value it, or if we have good reason to cherish it, or if we have good reason to obey it. And I'm saying, no, normativity comes first. We have to recognize the normative in order to get into the space of reasons and values and all the rest of it. So Levinas and Darwall deal with what I think is the connection between normativity and reason. Reasons arise from my response to the normative demand of the other, as Levinas puts it. But this is so it's a question of the origin of reasons, not of the whole space of normative phenomena altogether. And I just found it interesting that both Levinas and Heidegger, who in phenomenological terms are generally worlds apart in how they analyze things, actually come down to the same point, namely that the birth of reasons arises from a kind of command that they both link with the phenomenon of conscience. And so that's as far as I want to go. I mean, there are many other kinds, how the other kinds of normativity are connected to this fundamental form, which both Darwall and Kant and Levinas and Heidegger all seem to recognize, and is established in the distinction between value theory and theory of practice. I just found it very interesting that they, as two phenomenologists who are very different, both come to the same conclusion about the origin of reason in the call of conscience. And I'm just trying to work out the details of that in my own work.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Professor Kroll. Thank you again for the seeing the rich podcast.
I have a very hard time hearing. I'll try to turn up.
I'll do close. Hello, Professor. Thank you again. And I'd like to raise, I think, two or three, again, three questions. So the first one is relative to brief. It concerns your conception of relation between conscience and shame. So it strikes me quite interesting that it seems to collapse the usual distinction between these two, conscience and shame. So of course Heidegger discusses conscience but not shame, and Sartre discusses shame but not conscience, and he seems to be saying that Levinas somehow collapsed the distinction, and somehow he somehow equates them.
It equates shame and what?
And conscience.
Okay.
Yeah. And so maybe I'd just like to know, do you think it's something he does explicitly and deliberately, because it is, I think, traditionally believed to be rather different? Conscience as more self-concerned, and shame as more other-directed, and so it is something that he does explicitly, deliberately, or is it more like your strategy to bring them together? And I guess this is closely connected to the way you want to bring together Heidegger and Levinas, right? So I think you mentioned in one of the earlier talks that you disagree with Heidegger's characterization of conscience, because he says in conscience, Dasein calls itself. So the caller is Dasein, and that which is called is again Dasein. And if you now want to bring it together with Levinas, it seems to be that you are saying that no, the caller is not Dasein, right? So is that the way you want to bring them together? And what do you think is the price you have to pay to do that?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, okay. The first question is, I think, very important and very complicated in many ways. I mean, I agree, and Levinas insists on this, that shame is, and this is why I brought Sartre in, that shame is always shame in the face of another, right? That somehow to feel ashamed presupposes something like an audience or a community whose norms have been violated in some way. So there's shame cultures are often described as cultures in which the community marshals or uses shame to keep people in line and so on. But and this is often contrasted with guilt culture, in which the phenomenon of guilt is distinguished from shame because, in a way, I can acknowledge my guilt without, as it were, being judged by another person. I can discover my own guilt without making reference to the judgment of others. So there are two different things, and if you look in Darwall, he tries to tease these out, and I think he doesn't. I don't think he does that in a way that I would want to embrace. But if the question is why are we authorized to, or why does Levinas think he can associate shame with conscience? I think it's because of his general point, namely that that we understand what he means by the face of the other. The others can appear only in my conscience, by which he wants to say that there's a dimension in me that can generate not only guilt, but shame. And this is difficult to explain. That is, there's a call, and the call comes from the call of conscience situates me as the addressee. And so there is an empty space for the addresser. Who is the addresser? But in any case, as long as you have this addresser-addressee structure, it's not, it isn't out of the question to identify what the call gives rise to me in me as shame, because there is another there. Okay. Heidegger, in turn, goes through a kind of similar stripping away of ordinary views about shame and guilt in order to focus on what he takes to be the formally indicated phenomenological meaning of the call. So he says things like, well, the kind of shame or guilt that's at issue here has nothing to do with anything that I have done. It has something to do with what kind, with who I am. And similarly, I mean, Levinas identifies the call of conscience not with some particular thing I've done, but with the very nature of my freedom as normatively heedless appropriation of everything in the world according to my wants and needs. So it really doesn't have anything to do with any laws or any what we would normally consider shameful behavior or whatever. It's just stripped down to the recognition that my being is originally normatively heedless, and so I'm trying to answer, how do you enter into the space of the normative altogether? Well, by recognizing the call of conscience in oneself and responding to it in Levinas's case by what he calls desire for goodness. I see there's something better than the kind of being I am. And in Heidegger's case, it's taking over being a ground or being responsible for what I think is best. And so both of them have this reference to the beyond being, Plato's notion of epikenetes ousias. The other question, I disagree, that there seems to be, and I think in another version of that paper, I did discuss this. There seems to be a real difference between Levinas and and Heidegger on the structure of conscience, because Levinas identifies the face of the other entirely with my reception of this interdictory command. In other words, Levinas doesn't say that the other is God, and he doesn't say that the other is all these other people around me or anything. He goes into various kind of arcane arguments, as I tried to hint at in the last couple of pages of the paper. He goes into some very difficult arguments to show how this original experience of interdictory check on my freedom has anything to do with liberalism and respect for others and ordinary politics and so on. But he's very clear that I can't identify the other, the caller of the call of conscience with some entity in the world. And Heidegger, in contrast, even though he generally discusses he says in one place, the indeterminacy of who is doing the calling, who the caller of conscience is part of its phenomenological structure. That's part of its very phenomenological structure. And so there he agrees, I think, with Levinas. That's the phenomenology of it. That the caller of the call of conscience, as he puts it, is no one in the world with me. But then Heidegger, I think, makes a mistake and says, well, the caller is Dasein itself. And he wants to say that it's Dasein, the authentic Dasein is calling to inauthentic Dasein, and there's just no evidence for that. There's the structure of conscience. I mean, I could say, well, it's God, or it's my mother, or it's the Freudian, superego, or it's any number of things. But all of those intentional, all of those cognitive identifications of who the caller is are all subsequent to the call itself. And one of those is as good as another. I mean, Freud, it's the superego, the residue of my parents' upbringing, or Heidegger, it's Dasein's authentic Dasein is calling to inauthentic Dasein. Or somebody else will say it's the voice of God. I think phenomenologically, the point about conscience is we can't identify the addressor. We can't identify the caller. And we especially cannot take the place of it. We can't identify it with ourselves, like with our better self or something like that. We just have to take the experience of normative command as basic, primitive. And anyway, that's how I try to think about those issues.
Yeah. Okay. Other people? No. Once again, thank you for this very rich talk. And I think I have one comment and two or more, maybe three questions. The comment, well, I think you're absolutely right, thinking that we need to talk about the origin of normativity, and which is actually a lacuna in Stephen Darwall's second person reason theory. And you also acknowledge there is a Fichte point which exists in Darwall's theory. But the point is, if we only understand the Fichte point as a self-positing, I think this is a truncated version of Fichte theory. At least so far as I read Fichte, especially in Zittenlever's 1797, and Fichte, the first part of that book actually shows that Fichte wants to give the theory with respect to the origin of normativity. So he talked about how the self-consciousness, Selbstbewusstsein as this fundamental ground or the origin of the categorical imperatives. That is a way which Fichte tried to develop for this question. But that certainly differs from Levinas' idea. Maybe in a formal aspect, it's just the opposite, because he wouldn't say, okay, the asymmetry or the height of the other would become the arcade of this normativity. This is just the one comment. I think we have to correct this Fichte point in Darwall's theory. Then the first question, because when you talk about this, the Levinasian theory, and try to show how this asymmetry, namely the command from the height of the other, actually become the origin of this normativity. But then the danger, especially when you talk about how this asymmetry can really give rise to the symmetry, which must be presupposed in our normativity theory. So in your paper, you said, let me just quote it. The asymmetry of the command is therefore communalized because the other comes to join me to himself for service. And at this point, you certainly introduce the just and the third party. So here, I think this is a failure of Levinas' theory, because it's no more symmetry, it's symmetry. Because the third party changes the asymmetrical relation between me and soul into the kind of symmetrical relation. So I'm just wondering how, or to what extent Levinasian asymmetrical theory of this command from the height of other can really serve as the origin of normativity. Or maybe Levinas, for that purpose, he has to retreat to the symmetrical relation on the basis of the third parties. This is my first question.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and it's received a lot of discussion in the literature, but I don't find it that discussion very satisfying. In fact, I share your uncertainty about whether Levinas can really get back to symmetry, the kind of symmetry that he wants, where he calls rejoining liberalism. Yeah, I'm suspicious. I'm doubtful that his account has fully done justice to the problem, the phenomenological problem that is raised by starting with the self-other relation. How is the third party, where does he, I mean, it just seems like the third party comes out of nowhere in his theory. And the best I can do so far is what I tried to hint at a little bit in this paper, but I'm not satisfied with the answer. That the original response to conscience, to the command of the other, who comes from the asymmetrical other, is what Levinas calls generosity. I mean, I think this is a very interesting moment in Totality and Infinity, the book where this all comes from, where he transitions from a picture of animal life, you might say, as always appropriating everything in its field of experience, one way or another, right? Through, I mean, and he talks about through labor and through nourishment, the violence involved in incorporating otherness into the same. But it's very interesting when he says, when I have recognized the interdict on the thou shalt not kill, or when I've recognized the interdict, and I've recognized the impotence of violence, that is to say, the impossibility that violent behavior or killing the other can get rid of my obligation not to kill. The obligation remains. Once I've internalized this, this gives rise to this reactive attitude, which isn't resentment, but desire for something better than what he calls the good, or whatever, but something better than this this solipsistic and self-indulgent freedom. And he says, okay, what this selfishness is transformed into when I enter normative space is generosity, giving my world, as it were, instead of taking everything, in giving my world to the other, offering it to the other. But I don't, the basis for this offering is not that I give them something, but that I transform my relation to the world into communicative form, into language. So, I mean, he's playing on a variety of linguistic games in a way, but he says things like language is dispossession. That is, it's giving up what was mine, and I give my opinion to the other, right? I see the world a certain way, and I give my opinion to the other. I say something, but I generalize it. I use the generality of concepts to be generous. And when I say the dog or the tree, I've now transformed those things into something that we can share, right? That we're both related to via the generality of concepts. So I actually think that's where I would start to try to cash in what he means by the third party, because when I'm speaking to the other, instead of trying to kill the other or, you know, enslave the other or something, when I'm speaking to the other, I'm already I've transformed my world, my possession, my perspective into something that is offered to other people. And so this is what he says, the concept or reason transforms the world into something we have in common. And so that, I think, and that's why he says it's the origin of reason. Language is reason. And I think it's really there that this rejoining of liberalism and trying to get symmetry between me and every other existing human being that I encounter, none of whom can be directly identified with the voice, the addressor in conscience. When I encounter these other linguistic beings, I'm already on an equal footing with them through language. We're, you know, even though ontologically Levinas says quite rightly that you do not form a common concept because one is the addressor and one is the addressee. In this notion of language that he's working with, we do have the kind of symmetry that is involved in sharing the world together. But I agree with you that the stuff that I was saying toward the end of the paper, which is his attempt to generate something like the symmetry of free and rational persons in Fichte and Kant and Darwall doesn't really, it's not really that convincing. But I think I would try to go in another direction, in the direction of language, to try to cash out the claims that he's making.
Yeah, connected to the first question, my second question actually concerned with the difference between Heideggerian notion of conscience and Levinas one, because in Darwin types, the Heideggerian notion of conscience consists of the structure, namely der Hof kommt aus mir und auch über mich. So this is a kind of self-relation of Dasein. And for Levinas, even though as you in your answer to Dr. Huangdi, we cannot identify what the color is, but still the relation between the color and the chord can still be identified. Namely, for in Levinas, the relation is between me and the other. So the problem is if for Heidegger that is a self-relation of Dasein, the other is the me and other. To what extent we can really put them together?
Yeah. Well, this is a point. I mean, there's a whole literature, maybe you know it, that tries to challenge Levinas on his supposed humanism, because let's say, people raise the question, well, does my dog have a face? Does the tree have a face? Do we have moral? Is the addresser of the command? I don't know, a mountain or something. Because Levinas obviously exemplifies the notion of the other by what he calls the widow, the stranger, and the orphan. That is to say, the destitute. And he takes this notion of destitution, that is having nothing, as an emblem of what the other is. And ultimately, one cannot identify the height, the other as height, with anything, as he says, that is seen or touched. The other is reduced, I would say, entirely to the command. And Levinas doesn't really agree with that, but I'm an independent phenomenologist, and so I think that he's on to an important phenomenological point, but he wants to he doesn't take it all the way. But he comes very close when he says the other can appear to me in no other way than in my conscience. And I took up that point because, as he says, the face is neither seen nor touched. So it's a question about whether a dog has a face, or my front lawn has a face, or and it seems ridiculous, but it's a point about conscience that it's not possible to identify the addressor. The call of conscience. So I think that's. I mean, I can say, oh, the call of conscience is God or another person or my mother or whatever, but those are already presuppose the phenomenon of the face in Levinas' sense. So the main point of the question and how I would answer it is to say that Levinas is in exactly the same position as Heidegger on this matter. When Heidegger says the call comes aus mir und doch über mich, or something like that, or you can understand what he's saying. I mean, when he says it's out of me or whatever, he's saying that this is a first person phenomenon in the sense that I'm experiencing it, you know. And then when he says doch über mich, well, here's the Levinasian notion of height or beyond. When it's over me, then Heidegger thinks that he can identify this over me with an exalted or the normatively privileged sense of myself called the authentic self. But there's no phenomenological justification for that. I think he's just wrong. And so we have to keep that über mich or the beyond, both in Levinas and Heidegger, empty. The basic phenomenon of conscience is that I have the experience of, and I feel the normative force of a claim on my freedom. And I can fill in the collar with anything I want, but you know, in religious belief, I can call it God, or in psychoanalysis, I can call it superego, but these are all subsequent acts, which the evidence always falls way short of any such identification. And phenomenologically, what's important is the experience of being called into question, or in my view, that's what I would individually and independently want to argue as a phenomenologist against Heidegger in particular, but also the waffling and ambiguity in Levinas's relation to humanism and whether the other is the other human being or something like that. But I admit it's something where I have to take a stand and make a revision on the phenomenology offered by these two thinkers.
Yeah, and this actually
Can I quick follow up on this?
Yeah, sure.
So I find your strategy of bringing together Heidegger and Levinas quite intriguing. Still, there is some, I think, lingering doubts as it concerns mostly your effort to formalize the phenomena of conscience in a way that allow you to bring them together. So basically, you see in Heidegger, for example, the call of conscience does not come in the beginning, right? It comes in the second part of the book, the second section of the book, and then it presupposes the whole discussion of everydayness. So in order for the call of conscience to make sense, you have to have all the structure of Dasein, you have to have the Stehen and Befindlichkeit, and especially Rede, because as you know, call of conscience is a modification of Rede. And so it does not, as it is the case in Levinas, the call of conscience does not first institute normativity, it does not first introduce us into language, it presupposes language, right? It presupposes, be it in inauthentic mode of language, but it presupposes that. So, but in Levinas, it seems to want something different. So here, there seems to be a very, I think, important difference that I cannot quite see how you can cover that over.
Yes, this is an excellent point. I cut out a part in the paper where I lay my cards on the table, or my interpretation of that in the earlier paper on reasons. The structure of being in time is circular, or a hermeneutic spiral. And so Heidegger begins with Dasein's everydayness and provides a phenomenological description of how meaning arises. He puts all of the his concepts into play, like Worum willen, acting for the sake of something, you know, availability, or ready to hand, present at hand, the anonymous, anyone, das man, all of these things. These are descriptions of our everydayness, and they generate a certain set of working concepts and a picture of our existence, which is the starting point. But I would just reverse what you said, and I would say everything in Division 1 presupposes what is in Division 2, because he lays out these concepts on an everyday basis, and then says, well, actually the conditions for the possibility of being and, as it were, inauthentic Dasein is that Dasein have this other capacity for being a self, because all we get in Division 1 is das Man, Dasein as oneself, the anonymous anyone, roughly speaking. And but selfhood belongs to the Dasein as what he calls solus ipse. And so if you look at the chapter on angst, he'll say, this is a distinctive way in which Dasein is disclosed to itself. And what it is, it's the breakdown of the everyday self, which shows that, or supposed to show through later arguments, that that Dasein is a kind of being that can get lost in the world and flee into the world, but also has this other capacity for normative self-orientation, not being oriented by das Man. And only, I mean, what is the difference between das Man and an animal, herd animal, or a pack animal, right? Well, it's that the das Man actually inhabits a space of normatively structured meaning, and that's not accounted for by norms in the typical way. That presupposes norm responsiveness, or at least this is the structure that Heidegger presents in Being and Time. Everything in Division 1 presupposes what's in Division 2. So that's its hermeneutic kind of structure. And if you look at it that way, Levinas's position is just a reverse of Heidegger. He doesn't really start with everydayness. He starts with a conception of freedom as totally, as it were, asocial, and as solipsistic. He calls it ipseity and enjoyment. And so totality and infinity starts the other way around, from a kind of bare, non-normatively sensitive living being, and tracks its emergence into the normative. But Heidegger begins with a being who's normatively sensitive, and then tries to explain how that's possible in Division 2.
But in
So that's how I think, yeah.
I think it's certainly true that in one way Division 1 depends on Division 2, as you just explained. But in another direction, everything in Division 2 also presupposes what is said in Division 1, because for a breakdown to happen, there has to something be there that breaks down, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm saying it's circular. In other words, it's like reading a novel. You know, when you start one, you have an anticipation of what the complete picture is going to look like, but it's not fulfilled. And so Heidegger starts these descriptions and then works his way toward, the climax of the novel. And then you have to go back and think again about what you read to begin with. But yeah, you're right. I mean, the descriptions of Dasein as breakdown presupposes that Dasein is, first of all, the anonymous anyone or das Man, or is just in the social world in a, as he sometimes puts it, indifferent way, neither authentic nor inauthentic. And the whole task of being in time is to start with that everyday way of being and describe it in such a way that we need to ask what further conditions are there for any being to have the character that is described in the first part of the text. So I guess that's how I read it. But of course, you're right. For if Dasein weren't, so to speak, already in normative space, then it couldn't break down. But in breakdown, you also see some conditions that are necessary for any being who can be in normative space. So it's a transcendental sort of argument there. At least that's transcendental phenomenology, uncovering the conditions for certain meanings that one experiences.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe let's just finally check one comment or maybe question in our chat room. Can you see that? I see someone.
I can't see. My screen is too small to see.
Okay.
But if anybody has a question, I'm happy to.
Yeah, maybe we can read it for you.
Well,
I will read the question.
okay. Oh, from the chat. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, the chat room.
In otherwise than being or beyond essence, especially in the distinction of say and said, we can see Levinas' own appreciation of skepticism. He says, skepticism always returns as philosophy's legitimate child. And Bernasconi thinks that skepticism is a model or metaphor of Levinas' discourse. But in totality and in infinity, as well as in your paper, it seems that he tries to show that we are not duped by morality, anti-skepticism. How should we understand this change?
Yeah, I didn't get the first part, what the change is. I know that skepticism is a big issue in Robert Bernasconi's very interesting article on that. And I can't recall what the actual argument is. So could you repeat maybe the first part of that, the question?
Okay. In otherwise than being or beyond essence, especially in the distinction of say and said, we can see Levinas' own appreciation of skepticism. He says, skepticism always returns as philosophy's legitimate child. And Bernasconi thinks that skepticism is a model for, or metaphor of Levinas' discourse.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one thing, and I wish I could remember more of Bernasconi's argument. I really liked his paper on Levinas's use of the evil demon. I mean, in his discussion of language. One thing that Levinas means, I think, by his slogan that ethics is first philosophy, is that if one recognizes the role that that the interdict on my freedom, the thou shalt not kill, plays in Levinas, then we've moved out of the range of typical philosophy that begins with epistemological questions or epistemological doubts or metaphysical claims that then get challenged. We're on the terrain of a normative phenomenon or a phenomenon of normativity that has its own authority, that I recognize, if I do recognize it. That is to say, not everyone does. Not everyone has that experience, but the skeptical doubts, as I said at the end of the paper, and I don't know whether this really answers the question, but skeptical doubts in that regard already come too late, because in order to enter into the space of reasons where such skepticism could be expressed and raised, I've already recognized the authority, the moral authority in Levinas' sense of the other. So that recognition, then I can question, I can say, what are its conditions, or maybe I'm duped or something like that, but I've already recognized it. And questions arise about who has the authority, or what it really means, and so on. But I think, in a sense, Levinas would agree that once you get into that, what we would call typical epistemological questions or philosophical questions about normative authority, skepticism is always going to be dogging my discourse. But I mean, the deepest point of Levinas is that I wouldn't even be engaged in discourse had I not already recognized the moral command. This is quite different than debating its validity or its universal validity. First of all, it has nothing to do with universal validity, and as far as what particular moral norms are the right moral norms, or whether we have obligations to animals or nature or whatever, I think those, for Levinas, just as for Heidegger, are issues that are thrown back into the space of reasons in which we are obligated to give give reasons and demand reasons from others. It doesn't mean that we have an absolute epistemological foundation for some objective table of values. It means that we're just in it together. And of course, skepticism is, from the point of view of a philosophy that treasures ultimate grounding in an epistemological sense, that's not going to, skepticism is always of the essence of that kind of philosophy. So that's about all I can do with that question, though. It's an excellent one. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. I think we have to stop here because we have far run ahead of our time. Okay, please, let's once again thank Professor Stephen Crow, excellent lecture, and thank you for your wonderful questions.
Yeah, and I'm very happy to join you again in 2 days, Friday with you and Thursday on my end, and we'll talk about something completely different this time, metaphysics. So I look forward to our next meeting, and thank you very much for your questions.
Okay, thank you. See you the day after tomorrow.
Yes, exactly.